Hey everyone, this is a piece by Antonio Carlo. It's titled Trotsky and the Party, From Our Political Tasks to the October Revolution. I'm getting this from the Ideas of Leon Trotsky, edited by Hillel, Ticktin, and Michael Cox. This originally appeared in Critique, number 7, 1976. Section 1, Our Political Tasks, which is a piece by Trotsky, is not among the most easy of Trotsky's works to read. This is so, firstly, because Our Political Tasks literary style is not Trotsky at Trotsky's best, and so difficulties of interpretation arise. Secondly, it is difficult to situate Our Political Tasks historically within the monumental political and literary achievements of the great Russian revolutionary, especially since Trotsky renounced this work during the years of exile. Trotsky said, quote, "I wrote a brochure in 1904, Our Political Tasks, in which I developed some views on the question of organization quite similar to those of Rosa Luxemburg, ... Nonetheless, all my later experiences show me that in this controversy, Lenin was right against Luxemburg and against myself," end quote. Trotsky. So Trotsky repudiated his closeness to the positions of Luxemburg, whom Trotsky came to regard as a spontaneous during his years of exile. These statements of Trotsky's have given sustenance to the thesis maintained by a number of historians, with Isaac Deutscher leading the field, that in 1917 Lenin accepted Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, while Trotsky in turn accepted the Bolsheviks' theory of organization, abandoning Trotsky's youthful spontaneism in the process. See Isaac Deutscher, The Prophet Armed, 1879 to 1921. I think that this view is simplistic and wrong. And footnote, Isaac Deutscher, The Prophet Armed, Trotsky, 1879 to 1921, and footnote. I think that this view is simplistic and wrong, if for no other reason than that, as we have tried to show elsewhere, after 1905, Lenin's views on organization underwent a radical change which brought Lenin close to Rosa Luxemburg. This was not just a modification or a richer elaboration of the organizational views of the Iskra period, as some like Pierre Bruet and Roger Garaudy, who was like a intellectual in the Pierre Bruet being like a French historian of Trotsky and the Spanish Revolution and the German Revolution, wrote big fat books about it, and like was the head of like one of the main Trotsky studies periodicals. I can't remember how to say it, Cahiers de Trotsky or something like that. And Roger Garaudy was a prominent intellectual in the French Communist Party, who later turned into like some kind of like Islamist Holocaust denier or something like that. He converted to Islam and then began to deny the Holocaust. But this is prior. This article is written prior to that. I think that was a development that happened in the late 70s, early 80s, as opposed to 1976 when this article was written. But he was like an intellectual in the French Communist Party. Let me repeat that sentence. This was not just a modification or a richer elaboration of the organizational views of the Iskra period, as some like Pierre Bruet and Roger Garaudy have maintained, but in fact an effective abandonment of those views. If we accept this premise, the entire relationship between Trotsky and Lenin on the problem of organization merits a radical re-examination. This is what we intend to do, attempting in the process to crack a few historical nuts that may be represented roughly by the following questions. Firstly, what was the background against which the debate on organization and the break between Lenin and Trotsky what was the background against which the debate on organization and the break between Lenin and Trotsky developed and matured? Secondly, why, after Lenin's shift of position in 1905, did the positions of the two revolutionaries, now almost identical, remain artificially apart until 1917? Thirdly, why did Trotsky himself give fuel to the view, objectively false, that Trotsky accepted the Leninist thesis, whereas the course of political and historical events was actually quite different? Section 2. The political situation of the Russian working class between 1890 and 1900 was characterized by the existence of social democratic circles, which encouraged the emerging proletariat in the emerging proletariat's struggle. These activities were craft-oriented and were organized, at best, by cadre still lacking broad experience, with few means, and lacking extensive ties with the rest of the vast country. Lenin was later to speak of this, quote, primitivism, which in its turn nourished the tendency to confine the struggle to the local, immediate, and restricted situation of the factory, economism. Today, however, we can see in hindsight that it would have been very difficult, given the conditions in Russia at the time, for the proletariat to have pursued the proletariat's development without passing through some such phase, marked by the strong presence of, quote, economism, even if only briefly. Indeed, broad political discussion reaching beyond the walls of the factory would have required a stronger and more conscious working class, which was capable of asserting itself as a hegemonic force in Russian civil society. But a working class still politically green and only recently emerged from the peasantry could not attain such a level all at once. It is understandable, therefore, that in its initial stages it was sensitive only to those problems which affected it in a direct and tangible way. The struggle around jobs. It is not surprising that economism, of which Lenin himself was one of the most advanced opponents, should have dominated unchallenged until 1895 to 1896. Footnote, see Antonio Carlo, the author, Lenin on the Party, published in Telos, number 17. Where am I? It took the experience of defeats and the growth of the proletariat brought about by the rapid development of industry in Russia to compel the movement to pose the problem of moving on to a more advanced stage. The first occasion for rethinking was provided by the failure of the great economic strikes of 1895 to 96. In the following year, 1897, Lenin, in two essays of major importance, was the first to pose the problem of politicizing the struggle, a process without which even the economic goals would not be achieved. Lenin clarified and radicalized this position in his later writings and won the concurrence of many leading social democrats in exile who were waging a fundamental struggle in the columns of Iskra against the old backward tendency of Russian social democracy. This backwardness, of course, tended to outlive the circumstances in which it had originally arisen, and indeed not all of those circumstances had changed. What is to be done, published in 1902, initially encountered no criticism from the Iskraists. At the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in 1903, there were few signs of battle, and the Iskra group seemed to retain cohesion throughout the first stages. This unity, however, eventually fell apart over the famous question of the conditions for party membership. As has been pointed out, by Deutscher, for example, the seemingly marginal importance of this problem concealed a fundamental disagreement between those who wanted a solid party of experienced revolutionaries, Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and those who wanted a more open mass party, analogous to the Western social democratic parties, which to a certain extent prefigured the legalist and reformist organization of the post-autocracy period, Martov and the Mensheviks. This was the disagreement that split the party into two wings. Trotsky, however, who joined forces with the Mensheviks, with whom Trotsky remained only for 1 year, merits a separate discussion. Trotsky was not a crypto-reformist, and this is shown both by his quick break with the right which occurred in the following year and by the role Trotsky played in 1905. It was no coincidence that Trotsky's positions brought Trotsky close to Luxemburg, whose criticism of Leninism were certainly not reformist. No doubt the harshness with which Lenin treated Vera Sasulich and Pavel Axelrod, to whom Trotsky was quite close, did offend the young, combative, quote, pen, end quote, which is what some people call Trotsky, but only with the effect of inducing him to clarify a number of critical positions, initially perhaps only latent, which Trotsky was not alone in holding in the RSDLP, as we shall see. To understand the origins and sustenance of the Lenin-Trotsky dispute at the Second Congress, we will have to turn to the report of the Siberian delegation, which Trotsky published immediately following the Second Congress, and which prefigured in broad outline the themes developed in Our Political Tasks. This text is of major importance in that it precedes Luxemburg's organizational questions of the Russian social democracy by 1 year, and anticipated the general theoretical discussion, although less profoundly, less calmly, and without her polemical balance. Footnote. Republished under the title Leninism or Marxism in Rosa Luxemburg, The Russian Revolution and Leninism or Marxism, published in 1961. End footnote. Trotsky writes, quote, "If beforehand, during the, quote, economist period, these comrades could not or would not link the particular industrial interests they served with the general tasks of class politics, which they ignored, today, in the, quote, political, end quote, period, they show themselves incapable of linking the tasks of the revolutionary political struggle, which they basically recognize only formally, with immediate daily demands, in particular, the limited demands of specific trades. If beforehand, in the period of, quote, dilettantism, they could not or would not link up in their consciousness the local detailed tasks with the need to create a central fighting apparatus common to the whole party. Now, at the height of, quote, centralism, end quote, they make a complete abstraction in their considerations and resolutions about this apparatus of all practical complexity and concrete character, of the tasks the party must carry out, tasks with which the organizational apparatus must conform, tasks which alone permit the existence of this apparatus. This is why, to go ahead a little, unilinear, quote, centralism, that is the purely formal centralism put forward by Lenin, found its warmest supporters in certain quote, economists, end quote. They were the ones who turned out to be the hardest, quote, iskraists, end quote, Trotsky. As we can see here, Trotsky indicts economism for economism's corporatist limitations, as well as those theoreticians who postulated a consciousness wholly external to the relations and struggle within the factory. Lenin in what is to be done, and Trotsky blamed the latter for the sin of abstraction. The solidly materialist assumption underlying such an argument is that a class cannot achieve consciousness solely on the basis of its specific social practice, dictated to it by the position it occupies in society. That is why Lenin's argument, divorced from the material situation of the proletariat, is abstract. In reality, the, quote, politicians, end quote, had not surmounted the position of the economists, but had overturned the position of the economists only mechanically, so to speak. Trotsky further maintains that the form of organization is not given a priori, but is a variable which is dependent on the politics that are its raison d'etre. There you have, in a nutshell, the theory of organization as a process commonly attributed to Luxemburg. The argument about the, quote, abstract nature, end quote, of the position of the, quote, politicians, end quote, was taken by Trotsky from a letter from a comrade that appeared in Iskra number 3, later to be cited more extensively in Our Political Tasks, in which we find assertions analogous to that of Trotsky, and again antedating Luxemburg. Since this letter was published, it presumably expressed a real critical current within the RSDLP, so that Trotsky could write, quote, yes, the Congress was the triumph of the, quote, political tendency, end quote, in program and tactics, and of the, quote, centralist, end quote, tendency in organization. But the same Congress showed that for many comrades, quote, politics, and, quote, centralism still only have a purely formal meaning, that they are only the empty antithesis of, quote, economism and, quote, dilettantism, end quote, Trotsky. Trotsky, therefore, anticipating Luxemburg's thesis, and hence independent of Luxemburg's thesis, makes himself the spokesman of a current within the RSDLP that was critical of both the spontaneism of the economists and the abstract political agitationism of the, quote, politicians, end quote. New section, section 3. Let us now quote from Our Political Tasks. Quote, in reality, our organization long since ceased to subject our organization's self to the requirements and needs of the, quote, trade union, end quote, struggle, in particular of the form the fight frequently takes on, the strike. In the course of our struggle against, quote, economism, to which we have opposed the practice of, quote, political denunciations, end quote, on every occasion, not only have we completely unlearned the art of leading strikes, but we have begun to suspect all, quote, trade, end quote, struggles in general, considering that these, quote, trade, end quote, struggles are not, quote, politically sound, end quote. At the beginning of the new century, announced in Russia, by such noisy events, the demonstration had already replaced the strike as a central means of struggle of local work. In a whole series of towns, the activity of the committees began to be limited to preparing a street demonstration, in the course of which all, or nearly all, the forces of the committees were involved in organizing an action, which in fact was not always all that flamboyant, but a demonstration without a precise object. The demonstration against the existing regime, quote, in general. The demonstration for its own sake. Lost all its power of attraction once it ceased being a novelty, ... In the towns where demonstrations had already taken place, the masses were not so keen on facing the bayonets, bullets, and nagayka, the Cossack lash, just to sing revolutionary songs and wave the red flag. Demonstrations will only rise up again, ... if demonstrations come out of the application of richer and more complex methods for integrating the masses into the sphere of matters of living political interest, end quote. Trotsky. In my opinion, this extensive quote captures the central point of Our Political Tasks and fits in well with the report of the Siberian delegation written a year earlier. Trotsky thus criticizes the fact that, whereas formerly there had been strikes devoid of any political content, now there were demonstrations devoid of any bearing on reality. In each case, the working class remained politically isolated. The real problem, on the other hand, was to raise political consciousness through daily struggle, otherwise the party would end up like the Polish Socialist Party, which had been reduced to an organization that did nothing but produce printed matter. It is extremely interesting in this context to see the assessment that Trotsky makes a few pages later of how the economists proceeded practically. The concrete example Trotsky uses is the great strikes at Odessa in 1896. Odessa, I believe, is where Trotsky went to college. I think he might have been in Odessa in this time. Trotsky was born in Ukraine. The economists worked with and among the masses, organizing meetings and assemblies, discussing the details of the strike, and analyzing their real concrete ability to resist the owners, preparing solidarity funds, etc. The wrong approach? ? Certainly not, but one which must be taken up and integrated into a broader political perspective. Trotsky gives a symptomatic example as testimony to the totally unproductive practical course of action that the party was now pursuing in the political phase. In 1904, a Congress for Trade and Vocational Education met at St. Petersburg. It was, in fact, a bourgeois assembly which was to demand the overthrow of the autocracy, but would instead be dissolved by the autocracy. When the members of the party committee told the workers of the dissolution, one of them got up and said, quote, "And now what do we do?" end quote. Indeed, the question of what attitude to take towards the Congress had been reserved for the elite of the committee, so that when the workers finally got to know about it after the event, the workers' reaction was naturally one of bewilderment, quote, "And what do we do now?" end quote. Trotsky says that the party should have acted quite differently. As soon as they learned of the Congress, they should have organized meetings and assemblies of workers to explain the event and to encourage a broad debate about the possibility of presenting a list of political demands from the St. Petersburg proletariat to the Congress. The presence of police repression was no objection. That had existed in 1896 as well, and then it did not prevent the mass work of the economists. There were two possible reactions. Either the Congress, that is, the bourgeoisie, would accept it, and the proletariat would find itself at the vanguard of the struggle against Tsarism, or it would reject it. And then the politically ambiguous position of the bourgeoisie would have been clear to all. Either way, something would have been gained, for the proletariat would have been directly involved politically. Whereas what actually happened was that the whole opportunity was lost, and everything passed without issue. Trotsky pursues his criticism of, quote, substitutionism, end quote, implacably. Quote, the system of political substitutionism, exactly like the system of simplification of the, quote, economists, proceeds, consciously or not, from a false and, quote, sophistical, end quote, understanding of the relationship between the objective interests of the proletariat and the proletariat's consciousness. Marxism teaches that the interests of the proletariat are determined by the objective conditions of the proletariat's existence. These interests are so powerful and so inescapable that the interests of the proletariat finally oblige the proletariat to allow them into the realm of its consciousness. That is, to make the attainment of the proletariat's objective interests the proletariat's subjective concern. Between these two factors, the objective fact of the proletariat's class interest and the proletariat's subjective consciousness, lies the realm inherent in life, that of clashes and blows, mistakes and disillusionment, vicissitudes and defeats. The tactical far-sightedness of the party of the proletariat is located entirely between these two factors, and consists of shortening and easing the road from one to the other, ... The greater the distance separating the objective and subjective factors, that is, the weaker the political culture of the proletariat, the more naturally there appear in the party those, quote, methods, which, in one form or another, only show a kind of passivity in the face of the colossal difficulties of the task incumbent upon us. The political abdication of the, quote, economists, end quote, like the, quote, political substitutionism, end quote, of their opposites, are nothing but an attempt by the young social democratic party to, quote, cheat, end quote, history, end quote. Trotsky, Our Political Tasks. The party's necessary function as a driving force is thus neatly shielded against any suggestion of spontaneism. We are shown only that the party can and must develop the subjective factor on the basis of the objective factor, the real-life situation of the proletariat. This, however, is not a simple forward-moving, mechanical, unilinear process. It is a process marked by advances and retreats, disappointments and defeats, the dialectical process. To accuse Trotsky of being mechanistic on the basis of the short phrase at the beginning of the cited passage, working class consciousness will assert working class consciousness's self sooner or later, is going too far. If there is any mechanistic thinking here, this mechanistic thinking is due to the revolutionary optimism that has been the stock in trade of every great revolutionary. Actually, Trotsky appreciated quite well that the process is contradictory and complex, and in need of the party's active intervention. And this puts Trotsky in a position quite different from that of the economists, including the young Lenin. Up until this point, Trotsky has only developed and specified the positions Trotsky put forth in the report of the preceding year. There is one point, however, on which the work from 1904 shows signs of a direct influence of Luxemburg's famous article, published shortly before, namely, where Trotsky, using almost the same words as Luxemburg, repeats the charge that Lenin wanted to impose a barracks discipline on the party, and forgot that social democratic centralism must not be a copy of the centralism of the capitalist factory, since the one is the expression of the discipline of a politically autonomous class, and the other is in general in the service of capitalist class interests. In other words, a revolutionary party cannot be a, quote, social democratic factory, end quote. An organization aiming at the overthrow of capitalism cannot copy capitalism's organization and division of labor, which are not at all neutral. Which are not at all neutral. So far, Trotsky's reasoning is flawless, but just at this point a contradiction appears in Trotsky's argument, quote, without fear of betraying my, quote, bourgeois intellectual psychology, end quote. I affirm firstly that the conditions which impel the proletariat into concerted collective struggle are not to be found in the factory, but in the general social conditions of the proletariat's existence, ... end quote. Trotsky. Or political tasks. Thus, impelled by the need to correct Lenin, Trotsky plays down the importance of factory conditions, to which Trotsky had given a central role up until then in Our Political Tasks. In that work, Trotsky had reproached the party for agitating around issues that were too general, and for neglecting strikes and occupational struggles, and Trotsky played up the activities of the economists which had been closely geared to factory struggles. However, quote, the general social conditions of the proletariat, end quote, becomes an empty abstraction if life in the factory is downgraded, since it is precisely this which is the source of the proletariat's alienated general social condition. Factory life carries factory life's influence beyond the factory. For example, a worker's leisure time is used to restore his labor power, and hence is a function of labor time and factory conditions. Unquestionably, the proletariat must challenge the capitalist organization of labor, but to say that the party must not be a, quote, revolutionary factory, end quote, does not mean downgrading the import, and indeed indispensable, role in shaping political consciousness of economic struggles arising from antagonisms within the factory. The reason for the appearance of this sudden contradiction in Trotsky's argument can be explained, I think, by the vehemently polemical style used by political protagonists at this period, which reflected the explosive situation, who quite often took abrupt turns in order to follow and combat the polemical twist of their opponents' arguments. Thus Lenin, confronted with the avalanche of criticism of his views after the Second Congress, would find himself saying in One Step Forward, Two Steps Back that he had not underestimated factory relations, since social democratic centralism had its roots in the centralism of the capitalist factory, of which, of course, is not immune to the original criticism. According to Wikipedia, One Step Forward, Two Steps Back, The Crisis in Our Party is a work written by Vladimir Lenin and published in May 1904. In One Step Forward, Two Steps Back, Lenin defends his role in the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, held in Brussels and London from July 30th to August 23rd, 1903. Lenin examines the circumstances that resulted in a split within the party between a Bolshevik, quote, majority faction, led by himself, and a Menshevik, quote, minority faction, led by Julius Martov. Back to the text. Trotsky clearly meant the first part of Our Political Tasks, in which strikes and occupational struggles are upgraded to be an explicit or implicit polemic against Lenin's What is to be Done, in which these elements are played down. The second part, on the other hand, takes up the battle against One Step Forward, Two Steps Back, where Lenin again stresses, with a dose of instrumentalism, factory relations. At this point, Trotsky, still a young and relatively inexperienced polemicist, takes an abrupt, awkward, and unforeseen turn in trying to follow polemically the zigzags of Lenin's argument, and ends up contradicting himself. Despite this marginal lapse, this work of Trotsky's, which also outlines a historical interpretation of various extremely interesting highlights of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, must be considered an important and quite timely work, judging from the quoted passages. New section, section 4. In 2 articles published as it happened almost on each other's heels in April 1970, Marcel Liebman and I defend the position that Lenin made a radical shift in 1905. In his views regarding the party's relationship to the masses. Wikipedia says Marcel Liebman lived from 1929 to 1986, and Marcel Liebman was a Belgian Marxist historian of political sociology and theory, active at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. I don't fucking know. Looks like University Library of Brussels. I don't fucking know. And, I don't know. It seems like his books include Introduction in Isaac Deutscher's Russia After Stalin, published in 1969, The Russian Revolution, published in 1972, Leninism Under Lenin, published with Merlin Press in 1973, and Born Jewish, A Childhood in Occupied Europe, published with Verso in 2005. Back to the text. Let me repeat that sentence. In 2 articles published as it happens almost on each other's heels in April 1970, Marcel Liebman and I defend the position that Lenin made a radical shift in 1905 in Lenin's views regarding the party's relationship to the masses, a shift which I think lasts until the beginning of 1919. Footnote. See Marcel Liebman, Lenin in 1905, published in Monthly Review in 1970. To see this, one need only read the following 2 excerpts from Lenin, typical of many others of a similar tone from the same period. Quote, "It was not some theory, not appeals of the part of someone or tactics invented by someone, not party doctrine, but the force of circumstances that led these non-party mass organs, bracket, the Soviets, and bracket, Antonio Carlo, to realize the need for an uprising and transform them into organs of an uprising." End quote. Lenin, The Dissolution of the Duma and the Tasks of the Proletariat. And further, quote, "The whole history of the Russian Revolution, bracket, of 1905, Antonio Carlo, end bracket, shows that all the powerful upsurges of the revolutionary movement began only on the basis of such mass economic movements," end quote. Lenin. Draft resolution of the 5th Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in Lenin's collected works. The autonomous revolutionary capacity of the masses, that is, a capacity that does not depend on the outside prompting of the "what is to be done" brand of theory, is clearly affirmed, and the resurgence of the revolutionary movement is linked to economic demands. At the same time, Lenin tries to give a more flexible and democratic structure to the party. We must ask then, why despite such a radical turn which aligns Lenin with Trotsky and Luxemburg, Lenin remained at odds with his great adversary until 1917? Are historians like Pierre Brouet right when they say that Lenin's inability to understand the Soviets remained one of the key points in the split between the two? I should say definitely not. Both Marcel Liebman and I drew attention to the fact that Lenin, in a letter to the Bolshevik newspaper in 1905, called on the party to undertake a radical revision of its negative attitude towards the Soviets, pointing out that the Soviets were revolutionary bodies of prime importance that had to be joined without demanding in advance that these Soviets accept the social democratic program, and that the party's own actions had to be rooted in the initiative and critical judgment of the masses. The real reason for the lasting split is therefore to be sought elsewhere. First of all, the letter sent by Lenin to the newspaper was not published. The letter first came to light in 1940, so that one of the major documents with which Lenin initiated a brief but sharp struggle to impose the new pro-Soviet line on the party leaders in Russia, Krasin and Bogdanov, remained unknown. Secondly, Lenin's volte-face did not remain merely an idea just because of the silent opposition of the literati to the proletarianization of the party. The end of the Soviets, with the failure of the 1905 revolution, made it difficult to implement the new line. The result was that to many people the Bolsheviks' approach seemed in large measure to have remained just as it was during the period of the political circles. Finally, if in 1905 the rupture between Lenin and Trotsky had in certain respects been objectively healed, in others it grew perceptibly deeper. At the same time, Lenin was defending the notion of the democratic dictatorship of the workers and peasants, while Trotsky was putting forward his quite different notion of permanent revolution. A polemic therefore developed between the two on this key point, and in the overheated and confused atmosphere of retreat that prevailed, this could only aggravate the old differences. Lenin and Trotsky, therefore, remained unaware that Lenin and Trotsky had come to see eye to eye on the problems of organization, and it was not until 1917 that this agreement was able to find a political form. By then, the situation was changing radically. The gravity of the world crisis and the bankruptcy of the Second International in 1914 forced Lenin to reconsider many of the past political blueprints, which had quite often been linked to the position of the, quote, center in the Second International. In particular, the theory of the, quote, democratic dictatorship, end quote, was a leftist version of the theory of revolution by discrete stages, first the bourgeois, then the proletarian, which, with some variations, was typical of the dominant currents in the Second International and had been accepted by Lenin. The view to which Lenin came was that Russia would be unable to salvage the bourgeois stage because of the weakness of the local bourgeoisie, and that the phase could only be carried through by the workers and peasants. But the gravity of the world crisis, which had exploded into an imperialist war, was, as Lenin argued in Imperialism, a book, in 1916, the political expression of the seriousness of the contradictions within the system and necessitated a reevaluation of past policy. In the interim, the February Revolution broke out in Russia, the Soviets reappeared, and the people wanted such simple things as bread, peace, and land. These, however, were unattainable within a bourgeois democratic system, since the tremendous crisis rending imperialism was also removing any room for maneuver within the system. So that in order to give any concrete answer to the minimal demands of the masses, it was necessary to go beyond the framework of the bourgeois capitalist world. The socialist revolution was the order of the day, and Lenin's April theses sanctioned his de facto conversion to the theory of permanent revolution. On the other hand, the strong resurgence of the Soviets allowed Lenin... Where am I? On the other hand, the strong resurgence of the Soviets allowed Lenin to take up again and to develop Lenin's position on the Soviets during 1905 to 1907. Once again, they would not be accepted peacefully by the party, or rather by the party's leaders, since the members were with Lenin. In the end, however, Lenin's line would prevail, and the Bolsheviks would be the only organized political force capable of upholding the concept of a proletarian seizure of power in the face of all other recognized forces, aside from the ambiguous, tardy, and transitory alliance with the left socialist revolutionaries. The ground was now cleared for Trotsky and the other independent social democrats to merge with the Bolsheviks. This, of course, would not happen all at once. You do not overcome 15 years of ferocious polemic and misunderstanding in a matter of a few weeks, but on the eve of October, Lenin and Trotsky would be on the same side. New section, Section 5. If our foregoing argument is correct, then clearly the thesis that in 1917 Lenin and Trotsky underwent a reciprocal self-criticism, 50-50, is untenable. Even with regard to the problem of organization, Lenin referred back to Trotsky's position, or, to put it more precisely, the causes that had prevented them from bringing to light the convergence of views, which had actually taken place in 1905, no longer operated. Nevertheless, in a certain sense it is wrong to say that Lenin accepted Trotsky's view. He had arrived at certain conclusions independently on the basis of his own political experience and without being overly concerned with the problem of theoretical primogeniture. This said, one last problem remains. How and why did Trotsky repudiate these positions on organization, which by 1917 had become the legacy of the entire Bolshevik leadership? To understand the development and efforts of Trotsky after 1919, we shall have to look briefly to the historical situation of Russia after 1919. In 1917, the April Theses and Ticktin Revolution, with their focus on the Soviets rather than on the party, expressed profound ties between the party and the masses, of which it was an integral part. Footnote. See Antonio Carlo's piece, something, opsited, and Ralph Miliband's Lenin's Ticktin Revolution, published with Socialist Register in 1971. End footnote. However, the situation was to get worse. The war and the economic crisis destroyed the best elements of the proletariat, which by 1920 had been reduced to a few 100,000 harried and politically declassed members. Those are the best elements of the working class who survived were removed from production and placed in administrative positions. Thus the last remaining members of the vanguard, separated from their class and from the terrain of production, which they knew, became mere functionaries of the state, a state which by this time was absorbing increasing numbers of petite bourgeois elements from the old state apparatus, because the dramatic situation that existed made it imperative that decisions be made and carried out no matter how. All this was compounded by the unreliable nature of the peasantry in the specific Russian situation. The petite bourgeoisie and the imperialist encirclement which required an iron vigilance. The party, which was becoming more and more inseparable from the state, found itself in the position of having to nurture a society in disarray, in prohibitive historical conditions, without a mass base, with a politically passive proletariat socially reduced to little more than a cipher, and totally isolated in a hostile world. These were the circumstances that caused the Bolsheviks to change their political perspective. From this time, the Bolsheviks were increasingly to identify the dictatorship of the party with the dictatorship of the proletariat, substitutionism, and to view mass organizations like the unions as mere transmission mechanisms. This turn, historically conditioned, affected the entire leadership from Lenin and Trotsky to Stalin and Zinoviev, the workers' opposition being the sole exception. Indeed, at the start it was Trotsky himself who took the hardest positions. In his celebrated brochure, Terrorism and Communism, according to Wikipedia, Terrorism and Communism, A Reply to Carlo Trotsky, is a book by Soviet Communist Party leader Leon Trotsky, first published in German in August 1920. Terrorism and Communism is written against a criticism of the Russian Revolution by prominent Marxist Carlo Trotsky, who expressed Carlo Trotsky's views on the errors of the Bolsheviks in two successive articles: Dictatorship of the Proletariat, published in 1918 in Vienna, Austria, followed by Terrorism and Communism, published in 1919. Trotsky's book, the first English edition of which bore the title The Defense of Terrorism, dismisses the notion of parliamentary democracy to govern Soviet Russia and defends the use of force against opponents of the revolution by the dictatorship of the proletariat and working class masses. Back to the text. Trotsky's own self-criticism of this work, which he was later to make, concerned terrorism and communism's extreme conclusions, not the premise from which those conclusions flowed, namely that the dictatorship of the proletariat coincided with the party dictatorship. This premise was not up for discussion. Trotsky's entire polemic against Stalin in 1923-27 revolved only around the party, which was degenerating and needed to be revitalized, and which was becoming increasingly cut off from the masses. Even the most libertarian document of that epoch, the celebrated Platform of the Joint Opposition, which is a kind of summing up, written mainly by Trotsky and Zinoviev, is of this character. Footnote: Leon Trotsky and Others, The Platform of the Opposition, London, published 1973. See also Trotsky's The Platform of the Opposition in the book The Challenge of the Left Opposition, 1926-27, published in New York in 1980. End footnote. Thus we read that the party has the power and must criticize and correct the party's own mistakes undauntedly. The party must reintroduce workers' democracy everywhere, in the Soviets, in the trade unions, and in the party itself. But to whom are these exhortations addressed? Trotsky and Zinoviev tell us, when Trotsky and Zinoviev paint a detailed and documented but disturbing picture of the situation in the party, of the party's social composition, giving the reader the distinct impression that the Workers' Party has no more than a name and a past. In practice, then, the demand amounts to calling for a restoration of workers' democracy to a party that is no longer a workers' party. The opposition omits totally any discussion of a, quote, cultural revolution, end quote, that would pit the masses against the leadership and bureaucratized middle layers of the party. We do not mean to say that there was any real possibility of such an occurrence at the time. There was not, for bureaucratization had progressed so far by 1923 that a challenge to bureaucratization from within Russia would have been very difficult. We wish only to emphasize a basic historical limitation of the platform that had been imposed by circumstances, but which was all the more material for that very reason. To be sure, in 1927, on the 10th anniversary of the revolution, the opposition tried to make a mass appeal again, but, as Deutscher describes so well, the crowd that marched by, silent and orderly, moved onwards indifferent to the group of leftist activists who, with their own banners and posters, were engaged in clashes with the police. This episode shows the totally distant and passive attitude of the masses towards the struggle for power. This was a struggle that had been going on for years within the party, in which even the opposition had accepted a party-oriented conception. Deutscher further points out that the slogans could only have been comprehensible to party members, illustrating how, through years of a party-centered praxis, the opposition itself had lost the opposition's ability to address the masses. No wonder, then, that this episodic, desperate, and awful effort failed. Footnote: see Isaac Deutscher's The Prophet Unarmed, Trotsky 1921-1929, pages 372 to 376. End footnote. During his years in exile, Trotsky would maintain Trotsky's party-centric approach, which had been shared by the entire Bolshevik leadership by 1919-20, and when the Fourth International was founded, it would become the party. It is hard to see how the situation could have been different. Positions such as those of Rosa Luxemburg, the young Trotsky, and Lenin in State and Revolution arise on the eve or during periods of major social upheavals when the masses are quickened to autonomous activity. Trotsky's years of exile, on the other hand, corresponded to a phase in which the regressive tendencies that began to appear in 1919-20 had become consolidated and ossified. The Chinese Revolution had ended in a sea of blood. In Europe, the working class was on the defensive, and the specter of fascism loomed large. In the Soviet Union, the bureaucracy had won out. The interludes in France and Spain in 1936 were too brief, were quickly brought under control, and were squelched. In 1904, Trotsky noted that during periods of retreat, the party tended to substitute itself for the masses. and played tricks with history. The prophecy was later to prove it true for himself and the Fourth International, which was to identify itself as the revolutionary consciousness of a proletariat, which on its own terms was social democratic or Stalinist. There we have the reason for Trotsky's repudiation of his writings of 1903 to 1904, and the legend that in 1917 Trotsky accepted Lenin's Iskra theses, etc. Therein also we see the ambiguous and limited nature of Trotsky's criticism of Stalinism and his analysis of the social nature of the Soviet Union. It is a criticism that touches the effects and not the causes of the phenomenon, and remains bound by a conception of the relations between the party and the masses, and had matured in 1919 to 20 and 1923 to 24, and was shared by both Trotskyists and Stalinists alike, although the former rejected its ultimate consequences. Only a few isolated intellectuals tried to go beyond this conception, Bruno Rizzi, for example, by seeking the real causes of the degeneration of the Soviet Union, but in doing so assumed a position that was too far ahead of the level of the masses. They therefore remained isolated and did not even carry the modest weight of the Fourth International. I should say that Bruno Rizzi, it seems to me at least, and I think I can find evidence for this that I'm not prepared to find now, but just off the cuff. Bruno Rizzi did not view bureaucratic collectivism as like an aberration of the Soviet Union, but believed that this is the title of his book was The Bureaucratization of the World, and in some sense he viewed it as progressive. And I believe it's documented that Bruno Rizzi had the idea, whatever other merits of his commentary, critiques of Trotsky's degenerated worker state thesis, had the idea that the working class of the world should side with Stalin and not only Stalin, but Hitler's Germany and the fascists in their ostensible, at least, anti-capitalism, and that the bureaucratic collectivist society that was its vanguard would have been in Russia, but also it was appearing in Nazi Germany and fascist Italy as well, was the wave of the future and was creating the preconditions for socialism. Even if it was not creating socialism, like bureaucratic collectivism would seem like, if you were thinking of like a stages the idea of history, bureaucratic collectivism would in some sense come between capitalism and the early beginnings of socialism. And this is kind of what, and it's funny because I think a lot of like the bureaucratic collectivist theorists who like accept Burnham, Carter, and Shachtman's analysis of bureaucratic collectivism claim that despite their protestations, the Trotskyists of the post-Trotsky Trotskyists accepted the same kind of idea, right? With the the potentially indefinite epoch of Stalinist transitional societies being a progressive step forward for humanity, however critically analyzed or however much they criticize Stalinism, definitely seem to put more emphasis on the progressive nature of Stalinism than on its fundamentally anti-communist, anti-human, anti-democratic character. The American bureaucratic collectivists who don't have their heritage in Rizzi, as some might suggest, they and the idea is like, ironically, post-Trotsky Trotskyists became the true Rizzians with their positive, if critical, acceptance of support for the Eastern Bloc in the Cold War. Their non-third campus position was a form of Rizziism or something like that. I think that's something that Sean Matgamna, for instance, who's kind of one of the main people coming out of the third camp Trotskyist tradition, says about post-Trotsky Trotskyism, which is going to be on this channel. I recorded a whole book of text from The Two Trotskyisms Confront Stalinism, which is the sequel to The Fate of the Revolution, Volume 1, of about Lost Texts of Critical Marxism, which is a collection of texts by third camp Trotskyists in the 30s and 40s. It's a critique. The introduction to that book is basically an extended critique of post-Trotsky Trotskyism, which I think is very insightful. Anyway, back to the text. Only a few isolated intellectuals try to go beyond this conception, Bruno Rizzi, for example, by seeking the real causes of the degeneration of the Soviet Union, but in doing so assumed a position that was too far ahead of the level of the masses. They therefore remained isolated and did not even carry the modest weight of the Fourth International. We do not mean to say that Trotsky's critique was useless, because Trotsky's critique was only partial and limited by prohibitive historical factors. Indeed, a good amount of the truth can be gleaned from Trotsky's criticism, for to criticize the effects of a phenomenon does not mean that one is criticizing nothing, and these insights were to serve an obligatory point of reference and point of departure for succeeding generations on their way towards much more radical positions. New section, section 6, and this is the final section, and it's only a paragraph long. Let us now sum up. Firstly, in 1903 to 1904, Trotsky set forth a series of positions that to a large degree anticipated Luxemburg, and which are the expression of a real tendency within the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. Secondly, the disagreement between Lenin on the problems of organization was overcome de facto in 1905 to 1907, but because of a complex series of historical circumstances, the reconciliation with Lenin did not take place until 1917, and then most certainly not on the basis of the positions enunciated in What Is to Be Done. Thirdly, in 1919 to 1920, the Bolshevik leadership adopted a relatively bureaucratic position which Lenin and Trotsky also shared. Trotsky would essentially stick with the position even during the period of his criticism of Stalin. Fourthly, Trotsky's rejection of his writings of 1903 to 1904 during this period expressed the abandonment of positions which by that time seemed questionable even to him, but which, far from being mistaken, were still alive and relevant. Okay, so that is the end. And this has been, let me go back to the beginning just to say the title again. Antonio Carlo's piece, Trotsky and the Party, from Our Political Tasks to the October Revolution. Thank you so much for listening.